She heard the crack of bone before she saw the blood. Clara Bennett was just trying to take the trash out end of another 12-hour shift, empty pockets, aching feet. But there he was, a man on his knees in the alley behind the restaurant, 5 men circling him like wolves, expensive shoes on the pavement, a gold ring in the gutter. She should have walked away. Every smart person in this city would have. Clara Bennett was not smart that night. She was human. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit subscribe, drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The rule in Moreno City was simple. You don't see what you don't want to die for. It wasn't written anywhere. There was no pamphlet, no warning sign bolted to a wall. It was the kind of rule that got passed down the way old people pass down recipes, quietly, seriously, with the unspoken understanding that if you didn't follow it, you didn't get to sit at the table anymore. Or anywhere else for that matter. Clara Bennett had lived in the city her whole life, 24 years. She knew the rule. She had learned it early when she was 11 years old and watched her neighbor, Mr. Horace, refuse to testify about a shooting he'd witnessed from his own front porch. She'd asked her mother why he lied. Her mother had looked at her the way adults look at children when they're too tired to explain the whole truth. Because he wants to wake up tomorrow, baby. Clara had understood. She'd filed that lesson somewhere deep in her chest and kept it there through her teens, through high school, through the string of terrible jobs that followed when her father's medical bills ate through everything the family had. She kept the rule when she moved into a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like someone else's cooking. She kept it when she started working double shifts at Cafe Navarra, the sort of upscale place that served $20 lattes and played jazz so quiet you could barely hear it over the sound of rich people pretending they weren't bored. She kept the rule every single day, until the Tuesday night in October when she didn't. It was 11:47 p.m. Clara knew the exact time because she just looked at her phone calculating whether she could make the last bus if she ran. Her feet said no. Her bank account said take the bus anyway because the Uber would cost $9 she did not have. She shouldered the black garbage bag, pushed through the back door of Cafe Navarra, and stepped into the alley. The smell hit her first. Copper and something chemical like fear had a scent. Then the sounds, the kind that made your stomach go cold before your brain caught up. Dull, heavy impacts. A grunt of pain, low and controlled, the sound of a man who'd been trained not to scream. Clara stopped walking. Her body told her to turn around. Her body was right. She didn't listen to it. She stepped far enough into the alley to see, and what she saw made her press herself flat against the brick wall, the garbage bag dangling from her hand, her breath gone. 5 men, all of them in dark clothing, professional in the way they moved, the way they spaced themselves. This wasn't a street fight. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution paused just long enough to make the man on the ground understand exactly what was happening to him. The man on the ground was on one knee, one hand braced against the pavement. His suit, and it was a suit she could see that even in the dim light, fine fabric fitted perfectly across his shoulders, was torn at the back. His face was turned away from her. What she could see was that he wasn't begging. That was the part that hit her strangest. 5 men beating a man half to death, and he wasn't begging. He was just surviving, absorbing it, staying conscious through what would have already broken most people. One of the 5 men crouched down to the beaten man's level. He said something in a low voice. Clara was close enough to hear the tone mocking, certain the voice of someone who knows the end of the story already. Then the crouched man stood up, nodded to the others, and they all walked calmly out the far end of the alley. Just like that, as if they'd finished a job which Clara realized with a slow, sick certainty they had. She didn't move for 3 full seconds. Then the man on the ground collapsed. Not dramatically, not with a gasp or a cry. He simply ran out of the strength holding him upright and went down sideways, and the sound of it, that quiet final sound, pulled Clara forward before her brain gave permission. She dropped the garbage bag. She crossed the alley in 8 steps. She dropped to her knees beside him and immediately regretted it because the moment she was close enough to see his face, she recognized him. Not personally, not from any conversation she'd ever had, any place she'd ever been, but from photographs. From the way people in this city spoke his name in quieter voices than they used for everything else. From the way her manager, Tony, had once gone pale simply because a black car parked outside the cafe for too long, and someone had suggested it might belong to him. Alejandro Salvatore. The name sat in her mind like a stone, dropped in still water, sending out rings she couldn't stop. Alejandro Salvatore ran more of Moreno City than the city council did. He moved through industries the way a river moves through rock, not by force alone, but by the patience of someone who has already decided where he's going. Real estate, import, transport, and underneath all of it, the other things. The things nobody put in newspapers except the ones who did it once and then didn't do it again. He was not a man you touched. He was not a man you helped. He was not a man who lay bleeding in an alley behind a cafe and let a 24-year-old barista kneel next to him. Except that's exactly what was happening. Clara's hands were already pressing against the wound on his side before she made a conscious decision to do it. She'd done a first aid course 2 years ago, mandatory for her job. She'd complained about it at the time, never imagined she'd need it, and her hands remembered what her brain was too panicked to think through. Pressure. Direct pressure. Don't move him. Airway breathing, circulation. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Hey, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. I'm going to help you. Don't move. Okay, just don't move." She pressed harder on the wound, felt him flinch barely, but it was there, which meant he was conscious, which was good. She told herself that was good. With her other hand, she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialed, waited. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? "I need an ambulance," Clara said. "Back alley of Cafe Novara on Harwell Street. A man has been badly beaten. There's a stab wound, I think, on his left side. He's losing blood." "Ma'am, can you tell me if he's conscious?" "Barely. He's breathing. Please hurry." She hung up, because in that moment, Alejandro Salvatore's hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, not threatening, just there. A grip that said, "I know you're real," more than anything else. His eyes opened, dark, unfocused, but searching. She watched them move to her face and she watched them stop. He didn't speak. He just looked at her with the expression of a man who has never once in his adult life been surprised and was finding it extremely inconvenient to start now. "Help is coming," Claire said. She kept her voice calm. She was not calm. Her heart was hitting her ribs so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. "Just stay awake." He let go of her wrist. His hand dropped to the pavement and his fingers curled loosely around something small, something glinting. Before she could process what it was, his grip went slack entirely and his eyes drifted shut. "Hey," she touched his shoulder. "Hey, don't do that. Stay with me." He didn't respond. She pressed harder on the wound and talked to him anyway. About nothing. About the cafe. About the fact that the last bus was definitely gone now, and she'd have to call her cousin Demi for a ride even though Demi complained every single time. She talked because silence felt like surrender, and she refused to sit in silence next to a man bleeding out in an alley she had no business being in. Somewhere in the middle of a sentence about Demi's driving, she saw it. On the ground beside his loosened hand, a small pin silver simple, the kind a person clips to a lapel. It must have fallen from his suit during the struggle. It lay there with the kind of stillness that made it seem important. Clara picked it up without thinking and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She didn't know why. She would ask herself that question many, many times in the weeks that followed. When she heard sirens, she almost cried. The sound of them was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in months, and the moment she saw the first responders turning into the alley, she felt the adrenaline that had been holding her spine straight start to drain away at speed. Her hands shook. Her knees ached. She became aware suddenly that she was kneeling in her work uniform, the neat navy apron still tied around her waist with blood on her palms, and no good explanation for any of it. She stood up. She stepped back. She watched the paramedics descend on Alejandro Salvatore with the focused urgency of people who'd been told something they hadn't quite believed until now. She heard one of them mutter something under his breath when he registered the face of the man they were treating, and she saw the way the other one went very deliberately blank. A police officer approached her, young, careful. "Ma'am, you the one who called this in?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what you saw?" Clara looked at the paramedics working over Alejandro Salvatore. She looked at the alley. She looked at the officer with his pen and his notebook and his sincere and complicated face. She thought about what her mother had told her when she was 11 years old. "Because he wants to wake up tomorrow, baby." "I found him like this," Clara said. "I was taking out trash. I didn't see anything else. The officer wrote something down. And your name? She gave him a name. Not a lie exactly, just Clara. Just Bennett. Just enough to fill his box on the form. When he turned to speak to his partner, Clara picked up her garbage bag from the ground where she dropped it, walked to the dumpster and threw it in. Then she walked out of the alley. She didn't run. Running felt like guilt. She walked like a woman who was simply done with her shift and needed to get home, which was almost true. She called Demi. Demi complained exactly as expected, but she came. She always came. In the car, Clara pressed her hands flat against her thighs and watched the city go by, and thought about the way Alejandro Salvatore's hand had closed around her wrist. Not to stop her, not to threaten, just to confirm she was real. That detail would not leave her alone. She'd read enough about men like him to know that nothing in his world ever happened without a reason. That everything was tracked. Everything was remembered. The men who worked for him didn't file paperwork, they filed everything. She had left blood in that alley. Her knees had pressed into the pavement. Her phone had called 911 from a number that had her name attached to it. You complete, idiot, said the rational part of Clara's brain. He was dying, said the other part. She looked out the window and didn't resolve the argument. She just let it run while Demi talked about her new job and her neighbor's dog and whether Clara wanted to come to dinner Sunday. Clara said yes. She said yes to everything Demi asked that night because she was barely listening, and Demi deserved better, but she needed the warmth of someone else's voice to stop herself from shaking. When she got home, she hung up her jacket. She stood in her bathroom and washed Alejandro Salvatore's blood off her hands. And then she reached into her jacket pocket and took out the small silver pin. She held it for a long time. It was a family crest. She could see that now under the bathroom light, more precise engraved with a design she didn't recognize. Old money or old something else. A legacy compressed into silver. She set it on her bathroom shelf next to her toothbrush and her face wash and her $3.99 concealer, and it looked completely insane sitting there. This tiny piece of something enormous sitting on the most ordinary shelf in the most ordinary bathroom in the most ordinary apartment of a woman who had just done the most reckless thing of her life. She stared at Ed. You should have walked away, she told herself. She already knew she wouldn't have. That was what kept her up until 3 a.m. Not fear, not regret. The knowledge settled and clear in the pit of her chest that if she went back in time and stood at that back door again, she would still cross the alley. She would still drop to her knees. She would still press her hands against the wound of the most dangerous man in Moreno City and talk to him about her cousin's driving until the sirens came. She didn't know what that said about her. She was a little afraid to find out. 3 miles across the city, in a private clinic that didn't appear on any map or any registry, Alejandro Salvatore lay in a bed while a surgeon he'd used before finished closing a wound that had come 6 millimeters from ending 22 years of careful empire building. His second-in-command, Marco Resti, sat in the chair beside the bed. Marco was 43, heavy-shouldered, the kind of man whose face had been arranged by decades of absorbing bad news until it no longer moved when he received it. He'd been with Alejandro since the beginning. He'd been in 3 different hospital rooms like this one, but he'd never seen the look on Alejandro's face when he finally opened his eyes. It wasn't pain. Pain was familiar to both of them. It was something more unsettling. Alejandro's voice was raw but controlled. It cost him something to use it, and he paid it without flinching. We're working on it, Marco said. The Carboni family is the most likely not them. Alejandro turned his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Who called it in? Marco paused. Dispatch got a call. Female. Said she found you. Gave her name as Clara Bennett. Listed her address on the report as how close? Another pause. The cafe on Harwell. The call came from inside the alley. Alejandro was quiet for 30 seconds, long enough that a lesser man might have thought he'd lost consciousness again. Marco did not make that mistake. She stayed, Alejandro finally said. Not a question. Until the paramedics arrived, yes. And then she left. Before the officers could get more than a name, Alejandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Find out who she is, he said, already on it. Not to touch her. His voice dropped, and in the drop was something that made Marco sit very still. To understand her. Nobody helped me in that alley. The people who work for me, not one of them helped me. A girl who works in a cafe helped me. Marco said nothing. I want to know why, Alejandro said. I want to know everything about why. He closed his eyes again. And Marco Resti, who had watched Alejandro Salvatore dismantle rival organizations and rebuild them as his own, who had seen him negotiate contracts with men who use violence as punctuation and never once lose his advantage, that Marco Resti felt something move through the room that he couldn't quite name. It felt like the beginning of something. He just didn't know yet if it was the beginning of something good. In her ordinary apartment, Clara Bennett finally fell asleep with the light on. She dreamed about nothing. She woke up to her alarm at 6 a.m. and went back to work. She made 27 lattes before noon. She wiped down the counter and restocked the napkin holders and smiled at customers who didn't look at her. And the whole time, every minute of every hour, she felt the weight of the small silver pin in her jacket pocket. She'd put it back there that morning without fully understanding why. She just knew she wasn't ready to put it down. At 1:47 p.m., her manager Tony came into the back room. You see the news last night, he said, not looking up from his clipboard. Clara stilled. No, she said. What happened? Tony shrugged the shrug of a man who'd learned not to be interested in certain things. Somebody found Salvatore's car abandoned off Harwell. They're saying he stopped, changed direction, the way people in Moreno City always change direction when the name got too close. Anyway, nothing to do with us. Right, Clara said. Nothing to do with us. She went back out to the counter. She made 28 more lattes. And 3 weeks later, she was in the middle of making number 29 when she looked up and saw Alejandro Salvatore walk through the front door of Cafe Navarra in a new suit, without a bruise on his face, looking at her like he'd known exactly where she'd be. The cafe had a particular rhythm on Thursday afternoons. Clara knew it the way she knew her own heartbeat, the 1 p.m. rush, the 2 p.m. lull, the slow crawl toward closing where the regulars nursed their drinks and the rempteres played softer and everything felt manageable. She had spent 2 years learning this rhythm. It was the one thing in her life that felt completely predictable, and she had decided after that Tuesday night in the alley that predictable was what she needed more than anything. 3 weeks. She had almost convinced herself it was over. Almost. She was pulling an espresso shot when the bell above the door rang and the energy in the room changed. She didn't understand it at first, just felt it the way you feel a drop in temperature before you see the clouds. The couple by the window stopped talking mid-sentence. Tony behind the register went the color of uncooked dough. The barista trainee beside Clara, a 19-year-old named Josh, who talked too much and meant, well, literally stopped moving with a pitcher of steamed milk in his hand. Clara looked up. Alejandro Salvatore stood at the entrance of Cafe Navarra, and he looked like he owned it, not in the aggressive way of a man making a point, in the quiet, settled way of a man who owns many things and has simply decided to enter this one. His suit was charcoal gray, perfect at every seam. His face, which 3 weeks ago had been a map of damage, was composed and unmarked, as though that night in the alley had been something that happened to a different man. Except for his eyes. His eyes found Clara the moment she looked up, and they didn't move. Josh, Clara said quietly, finish the shot. Clara, Josh's voice had dropped to a whisper. Is that? Finish the shot. She set down the portafilter. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked to the counter because her legs were apparently going to carry her there whether the rest of her was ready or not. And she stood behind it the way she stood behind it for every customer, and she said the words. She said 50 times a day. What can I get for you? Alejandro Salvatore looked at her for a moment that lasted considerably longer than it should have. Then he said very calmly, sit down with me. I'm working. I know. His voice was low, not a whisper, just efficient, like a man who had learned that the quieter he spoke, the harder people listened. Sit down with me anyway. Clara felt Tony's presence behind her like a physical pressure. She didn't turn around. I have customers. You have one customer right now. He glanced at the couple by the window who were suddenly very interested in their phones. They'll manage. Tony materialized at Clara's elbow so fast she almost flinched. His voice was barely above a murmur. Clara, take your break. Tony, take your break. The way he said it told her everything. He wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting her in the only way Tony knew how, which was to get her away from the counter before anything happened that couldn't be untrue afterward. Clara untied her apron. She folded it over the counter with more precision than necessary because her hands needed something to do, And then she walked around the bar and crossed the cafe and sat down across from Alejandro Salvatore at the corner table that no customer had ever chosen to sit at before today. He sat across from her. He did not lean forward. He did not loom. He just sat with the ease of a man who has learned that stillness is its own kind of power. And he looked at her, and Clara looked back and refused to be the first one to break. She almost made it. "You're alive," she said. "Yes." Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "Because of you. I didn't do anything remarkable. You stayed." He said it simply the way you state a fact about weather. "Everyone else in this city, everyone who knows who I am, would have kept walking. You stayed and you put your hands on a wound that wasn't your problem until you made it your problem." He paused. Why? Clara had asked herself that question approximately 10,000 times in the last 3 weeks and had not arrived at an answer that felt complete. "Because you were dying. People die in this city every day. Not in front of me." He watched her for a moment. "That's the whole reason. Isn't that enough?" He reached into his jacket pocket. Clara's spine went rigid. He noticed she saw him. Saw something shift in his assessment of her, and he slowed the motion down deliberately, the way you'd slow down around a startled animal, not condescending but careful. From his pocket, he produced a small silver object and set it on the table between them. The pin. Clara stared at it. The air went out of her lungs so cleanly it was almost elegant. "I found my suit when I woke up," Alejandro said. "My people had recovered it from the clinic. They catalog everything. It's a habit of mine. Every item in my jacket, every pocket." He looked at the pin on the table. "That wasn't there when they brought me in." Clara said nothing. "It was in the alley and on the ground. My men went back to check the scene." He looked up at her. "Your knee prints were in the grit next to where I fell. The blood on the pavement showed exactly where someone knelt beside me and applied pressure. And that pin, which has been in my family for 30 years and which I have never once lost, was gone." He tilted his head. "Until I found it in your pocket." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Clara." He said her name like he'd been saying it for years, familiar and unhurried, and it unnerved her more than anything else he had done so far. "I'm not here to threaten you." "Then what are you here for?" "To return what's mine." He pushed the pin across the table toward her. "And to offer what's yours." She looked at the pin. She did not touch it. "I don't want anything from you." "That's what my people told me you'd say." He leaned back. "They ran your background. Rent 3 months behind. Medical debt from your father's hospitalization. 2 credit cards at their limit. A job that pays you $14 an hour for 12-hour shifts." He said it without cruelty, the way a doctor reads a chart. "You're drowning, Clara, and you still didn't take anything from the man bleeding out in front of you." "Picking up a pin isn't taking something." "No," he said, "it isn't." He looked at her with something new in his expression. "That's exactly what I mean." Clara felt the conversation tipping somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She straightened in her chair. "Mr. Salvatore, I helped you because it was the right thing to do. That's the whole story. I don't want a reward, I don't want a favor, and I definitely don't want," she gestured at the generalized concept of him, "whatever it is you're about to offer." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What if I told you that what I want to offer isn't a reward? Then what is it? A debt paid." His voice didn't change a register, but something in it settled into bedrock. "In my world, Clara, debts matter. They're the architecture of everything. I owe you my life, and I am not a man who carries a debt comfortably." "Then carry it uncomfortably and leave me alone." Something happened in his face then. Not anger, not offense. Something she couldn't name, but felt a quality of attention, a sharpening like a lens bringing an image into focus. He looked at her the way people rarely look at anyone, like she was more interesting than he'd expected, and he was recalibrating accordingly. "You're not afraid of me," he said, not a question. Clara considered lying. "I'm terrified of you," she said instead. "But I'm more tired of being afraid of things than I am afraid of you specifically." "So, to know." He blinked, once. The first involuntary thing he'd done since he walked in the door. "That's a very honest answer." "I don't have the energy for a dishonest one." A silence stretched between them, and in that silence, Clara became aware of the entire cafe holding its breath. Tony had retreated behind the bar and was rearranging cups he'd already arranged. Josh had disappeared entirely. The couple by the window had paid their check and slipped out. At some point, Clara hadn't registered. It was just her and Alejandro Salvatore and the small silver pin on the table between them. "Take the pin," he said finally. "It's yours." "I'm giving it to you." "I don't want it." "It's not a gift." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stopped, started again, and she had the sense it was a man choosing words more carefully than he usually had to. "It belonged to my grandmother. She gave it to me when I was 12 and told me it would keep me alive." He looked at the pin for just a moment. "She was right as it turns out. Keep it. Consider it evidence that I pay what I owe." Clara looked at the pin for a long time. She thought about 12-year-old Alejandro Salvatore being handed something by his grandmother, and the 30 years between that moment and this one, and what must have happened in those 30 years to build the man sitting across from her. She thought about how much she did not want to humanize him, how much safer it would be to keep him a symbol, a name spoken in lowered voices and abstraction. Not a man whose grandmother had given him something to keep him alive. She picked up the pin. Alejandro Salvatore let out a breath so quiet she almost didn't catch it. "There's something else," he said. Clara closed her fingers around the pin. "Of course there is. I need to know who set me up." The words landed in the space between them and changed its temperature entirely. Clara looked up sharply. "The men who attacked me weren't random," he continued. "They knew my route that night. They knew my security pattern. Someone told them." His voice remained even. "Someone in my organization. And you're telling me this because you were there." He met her eyes directly. "Because you saw them. And before you tell me again that you didn't see anything." He held up one hand. "I know that's what you told the police. I also know that's not entirely true, because nobody stays long enough to press their hands on a stranger's wound and then walks away having noticed nothing." Clara's heart was doing something urgent and unhelpful behind her sternum. "I saw 5 men," she said carefully. "In dark clothing, professional. They left calmly, not running, like they'd finished work." "Any faces? The one who crouched down to speak to you?" She stopped. "Go on." "He had a ring on his right hand, big square set, silver." Alejandro went very still. The quality of his stillness always shifted. It was no longer the stillness of a patient man. It was the stillness of a man who has just been handed a piece of information that rearranges something fundamental. "You're certain," he said. "I was close enough to see blood, Mr. Salvatore. I was close enough to see the ring." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood. Clara stood too automatically, the way you stand when something has ended and you're trying to keep your legs under you. "I'll be in touch," he said. "I'd prefer you weren't." "I know." He buttoned the middle button of his jacket, looked at her one last time with that recalibrated assessment still running in his eyes. "But you know things about my life that very few people know. You're involved, Clara, not because I chose it, because you chose it when you crossed that alley." He said it without malice. That was almost the worst part. "That's not fair," Clara said. "No," Alejandro Salvatore said simply. "It's not." He walked out of Cafe Navarra without looking back, and the bell above the door rang, and then there was silence, and Clara stood in the middle of the cafe with a dead grandmother's pin in her fist and the dawning horrible understanding that he was completely right. She had crossed the alley. Nobody had made her do it. And now the alley had crossed back. Tony appeared at her shoulder like a ghost. "Clara," his voice was barely audible. "Whatever that was, whatever he said to you, I know, Tony. You can't. I know." She walked back behind the bar. She picked up her apron. She tied it around her waist with hands that were shaking just enough to notice and not enough to stop. Josh reappeared from the back room. He looked at her with the wide, careful eyes of someone who has overheard things he wasn't supposed to and is now deciding whether to pretend he hadn't. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Clara said. "Make me a coffee, double shot. You never drink on shift." "Josh," he made the coffee. Clara drank it, standing up, and thought about a ring on her right hand and the way Alejandro Salvatore had gone still. When she described it, and she thought about the specific kind of still not surprised, not new information still, but confirmation still. The stillness of a man who has just had a suspicion proven. Someone in his organization had set him up. Someone he knew. And somehow, against every reasonable instinct she possessed, Clara Bennett had become the only witness who could confirm it. She set down her cup. At 4:17 p.m., her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she thought about the fact that she'd already not walked away twice, and perhaps the habit was setting in, and she answered. The voice on the other end was not Alejandro Salvatore's. It was smoother, professionally modulated, and spoke with the specific calm of someone who is very well paid to sound calming. Miss Bennett, my name is Marco Resti. I work for Mr. Salvatore. He asked me to reach out regarding the arrangements he mentioned. He didn't mention any arrangements. That's why I'm calling. A pause. Polite practiced. We'd like to settle your outstanding rent and medical accounts as an expression of gratitude. Anonymously. No strings. Clara felt something cold move through her stomach. That's not what I want. Miss Bennett, tell him no. She kept her voice level. Tell him I said the same thing I said to his face. I did what I did because it was right. That's the beginning and the end of it. He doesn't owe me money. Another pause, longer this time. I'll pass that along, Marco Resti said carefully. He anticipated this answer for what it's worth. Then he should have called instead of sending someone else. Silence. I'll let him know, Marco said. The call ended. Clara put her phone in her apron pocket and went back to making lattes, and the cafe returned to its 4 p.m. rhythm. And from the outside, everything looked exactly as it had before Alejandro Salvatore walked through the door. But Clara Bennett had her dead grandmother's pin in her pocket and a name, Marco Resti, in her memory, and the absolute certainty that this city which she had lived in her entire life was not the same city it had been 3 weeks ago. It had been rearranged around her. She just hadn't finished figuring out the new shape of it yet. At 9 p.m., when she finally locked up and stepped out the front door of Cafe Navarra, a black car was parked across the street. It didn't pull away. It didn't approach. It just sat there, watching. Clara looked at it for 5 full seconds. Then she turned and walked to the bus stop and got on the last bus home. And the whole way she kept her hand in her pocket, fingers closed around that small silver pin, and she thought about something Alejandro Salvatore had said that she couldn't stop turning over. You chose it when you crossed that alley. She had. She just hadn't known standing at that back door with a garbage bag in her hand that crossing 6 feet of pavement could mean crossing into an entirely different life. She was beginning to understand that it could, and somewhere deep beneath the fear, in a place she hadn't expected to find anything at all. Something was awake that hadn't been awake in a very long time. Something that felt against all logic, against every reasonable instinct she owned a little like purpose. The black car was there again on Friday morning. Clara saw it from her apartment window before she even had her first cup of coffee. Same model, same position across the street, same specific quality of stillness that said this car was not parked but placed. She stood at her window in yesterday's socks and an oversized t-shirt that had once belonged to her father, and she looked at it for a long time and she made a decision. She went downstairs. She crossed the street. She knocked on the driver's window. It rolled down. The man behind it was around 40 broad through the shoulders with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by anything years ago. He looked at her the way you look at something you were told to watch, but weren't told would come to you. Tell whoever sent you, Clara said, that I can see you from my window, and that if I can see you, my neighbors can see you too. And my neighbors talk, and the last thing I need is people asking questions about why there's a car outside my building. She held his gaze. So either come inside and have coffee like a normal person, or park somewhere I can't see you. Those are the options. The man stared at her for a moment, then he rolled the window up. The car didn't move. But 10 minutes later, when Clara looked out her window again, with her coffee in hand, it was gone. Relocated, she guessed, somewhere less visible. Which was not the same as gone, and she knew it, but it was what she had the power to negotiate this morning. So she took it. She was getting good at taking what she had the power to take. She got to the cafe at 7:45, 15 minutes early, which she had been doing every day since Alejandro Salvatore walked through the door because she needed the routine back. She needed the smell of fresh grounds and the sound of the espresso machine and the particular morning light through the front windows to tell her that some things were still exactly what they appeared to be. Tony was already there. He looked up when she came in, then looked back down at his inventory sheet and said without any preamble, He came by again last night after closing. Clara set down her bag. Salvatore. One of his people left an envelope. Tony reached under the counter and produced it. Thick, cream-colored, unsealed. I didn't open it. Clara picked it up. Inside was a single-card heavy stock, the kind of paper that cost more per sheet than she made in an hour. 4 words in clean, precise handwriting. The debt remains. EAS. She put the card back in the envelope, put the envelope in her bag, and went about her morning as if the weight of it weren't sitting against her hip the entire time. By 10 o'clock, she had decided she needed to talk to someone, and the only person she trusted enough was Demi, which was a problem because Demi was exactly the kind of person who would either panic dramatically or become dangerously excited, and Clara wasn't sure which outcome would be worse. She called her on her break anyway. Demi answered on the first ring, which meant she was already in a chatty mood, which meant this was going to go one of 2 ways. I need to tell you something, Clara said, and I need you to be calm. A pause. That's literally the least calming thing you can say to someone. I know. Be calm anyway, she told her. Not everything, not Alejandro's name, not the ring, not Marco Resti, but enough. A man she'd helped, a man who kept sending cars and cards, a man who seemed to have decided that she was now a permanent fixture in some corner of his awareness. When she finished, Demi was quiet for 4 full seconds, which was a record. Clara Marie Bennett, she said finally, you helped someone in an alley and didn't tell me for 3 weeks. I didn't want to worry you. I am extremely worried. I am retroactively worried going back 22 days. A beat. Who is he? See, I can't tell you that. Clara. Demi. She kept her voice gentle but firm. I need you to trust me that the less you know, the better. I'm handling it. You're a barista, no offense. A lot of offense. You know what I mean. You're handling what does handling it look like? Clara thought about the envelope in her bag, about the black car that had relocated but not disappeared, about the silver pin in her jacket pocket. It looks like not running, she said, and not giving him what he wants. What does he want? I don't fully know yet. She paused. That's the part that worries me most. After she hung up, she sat with that for a moment. The honest truth of it, which was that Alejandro Salvatore's intentions remained genuinely unclear to her. He had not threatened her. He had not offered anything she'd found insulting. He had told her she was involved, which was true, and told her the debt remained, which she had refused, and then done nothing except watch her from a distance. In a man with his resources restraint was its own kind of statement. She just hadn't decoded it yet. She went back inside and made lattes for 4 more hours, and at 3 p.m., a woman came in and sat at the corner table and ordered a black coffee and opened a laptop, and Clara brought it over, and the woman looked up and said very quietly, Marco Resti sends his regards. Clara didn't drop the cup. She was proud of that afterward. She set it down. She straightened. I'm working. I know. The woman was around 50, composed the kind of put-together that spoke of long practice rather than wealth. I'll be brief. My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm Mr. Salvatore's legal counsel. She turned the laptop around. On the screen was a document. He'd like to formally close the debt between you. This is an anonymous trust established in your name. Medical debt, rent, arrears, and a living stipend for 6 months. No, Clara said. Miss Bennett, no. She kept her voice low and even. Around them, the cafe continued its afternoon rhythm, nobody looking, everybody listening. I've said no twice now. Does he usually require a third? Elena Vasquez looked at her with the expression of a woman who has delivered many proposals to many people and is recalibrating this particular delivery in real time. He's not accustomed to it, no. Then this will be educational for him. A pause. He said you might say something like that. He keeps saying that. He keeps anticipating me. Something hot moved through Clara's chest. Tell him to stop sending people. Tell him to stop sending cars. Tell him to stop sending notes on fancy paper. If he wants to speak to me, he can come himself. Elena closed the laptop. She regarded Clara with something that might in different circumstances have been respect. I'll tell him. Thank you. Clara picked up her tray. Your coffee's on the house. She walked back to the bar, and Josh looked at her sideways and said nothing. And Tony also said nothing, and for once the silence felt like solidarity instead of fear. That night, walking home, she'd stopped taking the bus. The walking helped her think her phone rang. Unknown number. Same one as before. She answered. You told Elena to stop sending intermediaries, Alejandro Salvatore said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. Low direct, completely without performance. I told her to tell you that. She told me. A brief pause. You also said if I wanted to speak to you, I should come myself. Yes. I'm outside your building. Clara stopped walking. She was 4 blocks away. She looked up at the street, almost expecting to see him, which was irrational because he wouldn't be standing on a random corner. He'd be exactly where he said. I'll be there in 4 minutes, she said. She walked faster. He was standing outside her building in the dark, in a coat that cost more than her monthly rent, and he was alone, which surprised her so much she almost stopped on the sidewalk. Where's your security? She asked. Close enough. He glanced at the building. May I come up? No. He accepted that without argument. Then we'll talk here. Fine. She crossed her arms. Talk. I found the man with the ring. The words hit her like cold water. Clara felt her whole body recalibrate. Who is he? Someone I trusted. His voice remained even, but there was something underneath it deep and controlled the sound of a man managing something enormous, with enormous effort. Someone who has been in my organization for 11 years. What are you going to do? He looked at her steadily. What do you think I'm going to do? I think I don't want the answer to that question. Probably not. He was quiet for a moment. I came to tell you because you're the one who gave me the confirmation. The ring was enough, it placed him there. It matched what my security footage recovered from 3 blocks away before they disabled the cameras. He paused. Without what you described, the footage alone could be explained away. Clara felt the weight of that settle on her. Without her, he couldn't have been certain. With her, he was. And now something was going to happen to a man with a square silver ring that Clara Bennett, barista, 24 years old, drowning in debt, had made possible. I didn't, she stopped, started again. I didn't give you that to, I know why you gave it to me. He said it with a directness that shut down the sentence before she could finish it. You answered a question honestly because that's what you do. That's not on you. It feels like it's on me. Then let me carry it. He said it simply. Not as an offer, as a fact, as a reallocation, the practiced way of a man who has spent decades managing the weight of decisions. That's what I do. Clara looked at him in the dark outside her building, and for the first time since this entire thing began, she let herself look at him without the filter of fear or the armor of refusal. She looked at him the way you look at something you're trying to understand at its actual scale. He was tired. She could see it now. Not physically, he was impeccable, recovered and constructed. But underneath the construction, something was worn, and the specific quality of the worn was not recent. This was a fatigue so old it had become structural, the kind you stopped noticing because you'd built your whole life around it. Was it someone you cared about? She asked. The man with the ring. Something moved across his face so quickly she almost missed it. Yes. I'm sorry. He looked at her sharply, like the words didn't compute in this context. Like I'm sorry was a phrase that hadn't been directed at him in so long, he'd forgotten its shape. You're sorry, he repeated. Betrayal is its own kind of loss, Clara said, regardless of what comes after. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed register barely just a degree, but she caught it. You have an uncomfortable habit of saying things I don't expect. You have an uncomfortable habit of inserting yourself into my life. Fair. The word came out almost dry. Almost, she realized, was something like humor. The discovery that Alejandro Salvatore was capable of something approaching humor felt destabilizing in a way she hadn't prepared for. She pulled her coat tighter. What happens now? To the man with the ring that's handled. He said it with finality that made it clear the subject was closed. To you, nothing changes unless you want it to. I want to go back to my regular life. Then go back to your regular life. He held her gaze. I won't stop you. But she heard the but even though he hadn't said it. But the people who hired the man with the ring know that the attempt failed. They know I'm alive. He let that sentence breathe. They know someone helped me, and they will at some point try to find out who. Clara felt the cold that had nothing to do with the October air. So my regular life has a complication, he said, through no fault of your own and through no intent of mine. He paused. I can protect you. I don't want your protection. What you want, he said with patient precision, and what the situation requires may not be the same thing. Don't do that. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Don't manage me. Don't map out the logic until I have no choice. I've had enough of having no choices. He went quiet. And in the quiet, something happened that Clara didn't expect. He backed down. Not physically, not visibly, but something in his posture shifted. Some pressure withdrew and he looked at her differently. Like she'd said something that registered not as defiance to be overcome, but as information to be respected. Tell me what you want, he said. Not what you don't want, what you actually want. Nobody had asked her that in a very long time. The question caught her so completely off guard that for a moment she had no answer, and the having no answer was its own kind of answer, and she could see that he understood that too. Time, she finally said. I want time to figure out what I want. How much time? I don't know. He reached into his coat pocket, produced a phone, simple, clean, the kind that looked ordinary but probably wasn't. He held it out to her. This is a direct line, he said. To me, not to Marco, not to Elena, not to the car across the street. He held it steady. If anything happens, anything feels wrong, anyone approaches you, anything at all, you call. No questions about what you decide. No obligation, just safety. Clara looked at the phone. She thought about the fact that taking it meant accepting something from him, which she had refused to do 3 times now. She thought about the fact that somewhere in this city, people who had tried to have him killed were going to eventually notice that the woman who saved him was a 24-year-old barista with no protection and no resources in a studio apartment with a window that looked out on a parking street. She took the phone. Alejandro Salvatore said nothing. He didn't look satisfied. He looked, she thought, relieved, which was a different thing entirely and considerably harder to dismiss. I have one question, Clara said. Ask it. The men who set you up, the ones who hired the man with the ring, who are they? What do they want? He was quiet for a beat that lasted precisely long enough to tell her he was deciding how much to give her. A family called the Carboni. They've wanted my operation for 5 years. They thought removing me was the fastest path. His jaw set. They were wrong. Are they dangerous? Extremely. He said it without drama, the way a doctor names a diagnosis. To everyone around me. Which is why I don't have people around me who aren't equipped to handle it. Clara heard the implication. She didn't flinch from it. I'm not equipped. No, he said. Not yet. The yet dropped into the conversation and sat there like a stone in still water. And Clara felt those rings moving outward and knew he'd chosen the word deliberately and knew she was going to spend the next several hours thinking about it. Good night, Mr. Salvatore, she said. Good night, Clara. She went inside. She climbed 3 flights of stairs. She sat on her couch with the phone in her hand and the pin in her pocket and thought about the word yet until it was past midnight and she was too tired to think anymore. She plugged in the phone. She set it on the nightstand next to the silver pin, which was still next to her toothbrush and her face wash and her $3.99 concealer, in which no longer looked insane there. It looked, she realized, like it belonged. That was the part that scared her most. Not the Carboni family, not the man with the ring, not the cars and the cards and the lawyers and the weight of a debt she hadn't asked to collect. The part that scared her most was that somewhere in the last 4 weeks between the alley and this nightstand, something had shifted inside her. Some wall she'd been keeping up since she was 11 years old, and her mother had explained why Mr. Horace had lied. That wall had developed a crack. And Alejandro Salvatore had not put it there. She had. When she crossed the alley, she turned off the light. In the dark, she pressed her thumb against the phone screen, and it lit up, and the only contact saved was a single initial. A. She turned the screen back off. She thought about what he'd said. Not yet. The patience in it. The certainty that time was something he had and could afford to let move at whatever pace it needed. She thought about the Carboni family somewhere in this city recalculating. She thought about being a woman with no armor in a story that had already decided she was part of it. And then, because she had a 6 a.m. shift and life did not pause for reckoning, Clara Bennett closed her eyes. She slept. And 6 miles away in a room that no GPS could locate, Alejandro Salvatore sat across a table from a man he had trusted for 11 years, a man with a square silver ring on his right hand, and the conversation they had was the kind that only happens once. She found out about Dante Ricci on a Wednesday. That was the man with the ring. She didn't learn his name from Alejandro. She learned it the way she learned most things about Alejandro Salvatore's world sideways accidentally, through a gap in information that nobody had thought to close around her. She was on her break scrolling through the local news on her phone when she saw the headline buried in the city section between a story about a water main and an article about a school board meeting. Dante Ricci, 44, prominent businessman found dead in his vehicle. Apparent heart attack. Services private. Clara read it twice. She sat with her coffee going cold and read it twice, and then she put her phone face down on the break room table and stared at the wall for a long time. She had known. She had known what was coming when Alejandro said it's handled. She hadn't let herself hold the knowledge directly the way you don't look directly at something too bright. But she had known. Knowing and knowing were different things. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected to feel something violent, nausea or rage or fear. What she felt instead was quieter and more unsettling than any of those. It was the feeling of a line being crossed so slowly you only noticed you were on the other side when you turned around and couldn't see where you'd started. She picked up the phone Alejandro had given her. She typed, "I saw the news." 3 minutes passed. "Then I know." She typed, "I need to talk to you." His response came in under a minute. An address, 7 p.m. She stared at it for a moment, then put the phone in her pocket and went back out to the counter and made lattes for 5 more hours without saying a single word about Dante Ricci to anyone, because this was Moreno City, and she had learned that lesson before she'd learned how to drive. The address was a restaurant, not the back of one, the front, the kind with a host stand and soft lighting, and a menu printed on paper thick enough to feel permanent. Clara arrived at 7 in her cleanest work clothes, which were clean, but obviously work clothes, and the host looked at her with the careful blankness of someone who has been trained not to register the gap between a guest's appearance and the establishment's standard. "Miss Bennett," he said as if he'd been expecting her, which he had. "Right this way." Alejandro was at a corner table already seated, and he stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected, and which destabilized her more than she wanted to admit. He waited until she sat before he sat, and he didn't open with anything about Dante Ricci, and neither did she. And for 30 seconds, they simply looked at each other across a table set with candles. She was determined not to find romantic. "You wanted to talk," he said. "Did you do it yourself?" she asked. No preamble, no softening. She watched his face. "No." "Did you order it?" A pause so precise it was almost its own answer. "He made a choice," Alejandro said. "The consequences of that choice were always going to be what they were. My ordering or not ordering. Don't." She kept her voice low, but it had an edge. "Don't lawyer it. Yes or no?" He met her eyes. "Yes." Clara let out a breath. She'd known, but the yes still landed. She nodded once slowly, the way you nod when you're absorbing something you don't get to refuse. He had a family. Something moved across Alejandro's face. A wife, 2 children. He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of answer about how he had learned to carry these things. They're provided for. They'll never know exactly what happened. That doesn't fix it. "No," he said, "it doesn't." The honesty of that stopped her mid-breath. She had been braced for justification for the cold architecture of his world's logic. Not for agreement, not for the absence of defense. "I'm not going to pretend this is a world I recognize," she said carefully. "The rules here are different from any rules I grew up with. I know. I need you to understand that when I helped you in that alley, I wasn't signing up for this. I know that too." He held her gaze, "Which is why I've never asked you to." "But I'm in it," she said it flatly. "Whether I signed up or not. You told me that yourself." "Yes. So what I need from you," she paused, organized the words because they mattered, and she needed them in the right order, "is honesty, not protection, not money, not lawyers. If I'm going to be involved in your world in any capacity, I need to know what I'm actually standing in. No managed versions, no information parceled out when you decide I can handle it." Alejandro was quiet for a long moment. He looked at her with that recalibrating expression. She was starting to recognize the one that meant she'd said something that required him to adjust his model of her upward. "Most people don't ask for more information," he said. "They ask for less." "I'm not most people." "No," he said. "You're genuinely not." He told her about the Carboni family then. more than he'd given her on the sidewalk outside her building. He told her about Lorenzo Carboni, who was 71 years old and had been trying to absorb Salvatore Holdings for the better part of a decade, not through violence that had always been his last resort, but through pressure acquisition, the slow economic strangulation of competitors. The attack in the alley had been a deviation from his usual pattern, which meant the usual pattern wasn't working, which meant Lorenzo Carboni was either more desperate or more dangerous than he'd been a year ago. Possibly both. Clara listened. She asked questions, specific ones, the kind that surprised him by their precision. She asked about timeline, about what the failed attempt would have changed in Carboni's calculation, about whether there were other people in Alejandro's organization who might be turned the way Dante Ricci had been turned. At some point, Alejandro stopped answering and simply looked at her. "What?" she said. "You're thinking tactically," he said. "I'm thinking practically." She picked up her water glass. "I'm involved. You said so. If I'm involved, I'd rather understand the board than be a piece being moved on it without knowing." He studied her for another moment. "Where did you learn to think like this?" "I've been broke my entire adult life," she said. "When you have no resources, you learn to think 3 moves ahead or you don't survive. It's just that my version of survive was smaller than yours." He didn't respond immediately. She could see him doing something behind his eyes, reassessing, reordering the way you rearrange furniture you've lived with so long, you stop seeing it. "The Carboni family's pressure point," he said slowly, "is not Lorenzo himself. He's insulated. His operation runs through his son, Matteo, who is less patient and considerably less careful." "So Matteo is the vulnerability?" "Potentially, yes." "And how does someone get to Matteo?" Alejandro's expression shifted into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the control, not the assessment, something that looked almost like alarm quickly suppressed. "Clara, I'm not suggesting I do anything." She set her glass down. "I'm trying to understand the shape of the problem. Isn't that what you said you wanted? Someone who could think. I said I wanted to understand why you helped me. You figured that out by now." A pause. "Yes," he said quietly. "I have. So what do you actually want from me?" The question sat between them, and for the first time since she'd met him, Alejandro Salvatore looked something adjacent to uncertain. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he said, "I want you to stop being someone I worry about." Clara blinked. That's not an answer about what you want. That's an answer about what you don't want." He almost smiled. The almost smile did things to his face that she was not prepared to evaluate right now. "You're right," he said. "Let me rephrase." He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to be somewhere that I can ensure you're safe without putting a car outside your window that your neighbors notice. That's still about you managing a problem. Every true thing I want," he said carefully, "is going to sound like me managing a problem, because I have been managing problems for 22 years, and I have forgotten how to want things in any other language." He stopped. Something in that admission seemed to surprise even him. "What I mean is I want you near." The last 3 words landed with a weight entirely disproportionate to their size. Clara did not look away. She also did not respond immediately because the honest part of her, the part that had cracked open a little more every time he had appeared and been something other than what she'd expected, that part had a response that she wasn't ready to give yet. "Near," she repeated carefully. "In my world, near means protected," he said. "It also means he seemed to be choosing very precisely. It means I stopped losing sleep over whether the Carboni family has figured out who was in that alley." "Are you losing sleep?" She said it genuinely, not as a challenge. He looked at her. "More than I have in years," he said, "and I find that extremely inconvenient." She sat back. She thought about what near meant in the geography of his life, the distances between normal and his normal, the width of the gap she'd have to cross. She thought about her apartment and her shifts and Demi's dinners on Sunday, and the ordinary shape of the life she'd been holding together with the specific, exhausted determination of someone who refuses to let go of something just because it's difficult. She thought about the silver pin on her nightstand. "I want something from you," she said. "Name it. I want to keep my job." He looked at her steadily. "All right. I'm serious. I don't want it paid for. I don't want it managed. I want to go to work and make coffee and have one thing in my life that belongs entirely to me. That's reasonable. And I want to know immediately, not after it's been filtered, when something changes." With the carbonas, with anything that touches me directly. She held his gaze. No more finding out from news headlines. Something tightened in his expression. That was an oversight. Make sure it's the last one. He inclined his head. Done. And I am. She hesitated on the third condition because it was the one that mattered most and the one that cost her most to say. I want you to be honest about what this is, not what it looks like, not how you describe it to your associates, what it actually is. He was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them, voices, movement, the sounds of a normal evening, and the quiet between them was its own separate country. I don't know yet what it is, he said finally. That's the most honest answer I have. Clara nodded slowly. That's fair. Is it enough? She thought about it seriously, which he seemed to appreciate. He didn't rush her. For now, she said. It's enough for now. They ate. It was surreal, the eating, the ordering, the silverware, the conversation that moved into other territory. Smaller territory, the kind of territory Clara hadn't expected to share with a man like him. He asked about her father, which told her he'd read the file Marco had compiled and was choosing to acknowledge it rather than pretend he hadn't. She told him about the last 2 years of her father's illness, the way debt accumulates not in single dramatic moments, but in the daily cost of small decisions, each one reasonable, on its own, catastrophic in accumulation. He listened with the full undivided attention of someone who has taught himself to absorb information completely and found somewhere in the middle of listening to Clara talk about hospital parking fees and insurance denials that he was not just absorbing information. She noticed him noticing that. Neither of them said anything about it. On the way out, she stopped at the door and turned to face him. The Carboni family, she said. Matteo specifically. Does he know about me? Not yet. When he finds out, he won't. His voice was flat and certain. I've ensured that. How? The 911 call record has been amended. Your name appears nowhere in the official account of that night. He met her eyes. That was done the morning after. Clara absorbed this, the official erasure of her from that alley. It should have felt like relief. Mostly it felt like another thing she hadn't consented to but couldn't reasonably object to either, which was becoming a familiar sensation in Alejandro Salvatore's orbit. Without asking me, she said, it was protective. It was also a decision about my life that you made without me. He paused. Yes. He said it the same way he'd said yes about Dante Ricci without defense. Just acknowledgement. I'm better at protection than permission. I'm aware of that. Work on it, Clara said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to understand was reserved specifically for her, the one that appeared when she said something no one in his world would have said to him. Something between unsettled and underneath it, something that moved like relief. I will, he said. She nodded, started to go, then stopped again. One more thing. She turned back. Dante Ricci's wife and children. You said they are provided for. Yes. Anonymously, no. Yes. Good. She held his eyes. Keep it that way. She doesn't need to know where it comes from. She needs it to come. He looked at her for a long moment. All right. I mean it, Alejandro. She used his name for the first time. It came out steadier than she expected. That's not negotiable for me. Something happened in his face when she said his name. Quiet, fast. The same thing that had happened when she'd said, I'm sorry on the sidewalk outside her building, the recalibration of a man receiving something he'd forgotten how to receive. It's not negotiable for me either, he said, softly. It never was. She left. She walked 6 blocks before she realized she was smiling, and then stopped and looked up at the sky and had a brief, private argument with herself about the smile and lost the argument and kept walking. Her phone buzzed. The other phone hers, Demi's phone, real-life phone. A text from Demi. You coming Sunday? Clara typed back, wouldn't miss it. She slipped the phone back in her pocket and thought about Sunday dinner at Demi's with Demi's terrible taste in background television and her incredible cooking and the way she would look at Clara across the table and know in the way cousins who are actually friends know that something had changed. Clara wasn't sure yet how to explain what had changed. She wasn't sure she could. She just knew that 3 weeks ago she had been a woman who kept every rule, who looked away, who built her walls high enough that nothing could fall in or out. And that woman had stood at a back door with a garbage bag in her hand and made one single choice, And the choice had been pulling her forward ever since, like a current she had stopped fighting because fighting it was more exhausting than letting it show her where it was going. She was almost home when the other phone, Alejandro's phone, lit up with a message. Not from the A contact, from an unknown number she didn't recognize. She stopped walking. She opened it. 4 words. We know who you are. Clara stood on the sidewalk and looked at the message for a long count of 10. Then she opened the A contact and typed, check your phone. His response came in 40 seconds, then a call immediate. I see it, he said the moment she answered. His voice was the voice from the alley, not the restaurant voice, not the careful diplomatic register, the operational one. Where are you, Tuam? 4 blocks from my apartment. Don't go home. Turn around. There's a car. I'm not getting in a car. Clara, tell me where you are, she said. I'll come to you, but I'm not getting in a car I didn't call. A beat, then 42 Warfield, side entrance, 3 minutes. I'll be 5. I don't run in these shoes. She heard something that might, in different circumstances and from a different man, have been a laugh. She turned around. She walked at a pace that was not quite running and was not quite calm, and she kept her hand in her coat pocket. Fingers wrapped around the small silver pin, and she thought about the message. 4 words, an unknown number, and the very specific flavor of targeted. And she thought about how quickly everything could move from theoretical to immediate. And she was scared, genuinely scared, the kind that sharpens you rather than freezes you. She turned onto Warfield. She found the side entrance. Alejandro was already there, and beside him was Marco Resti and 2 other men she didn't recognize. And Alejandro looked at her when she came through the door with an expression of something so unguarded it was almost difficult to look at. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps and stopped close enough that she could see the specific quality of the relief on his face. You're all right, he said. I told you I would be. She pulled out the phone and showed him the screen. How did they get this number? His jaw set. Because this number was given out by someone who shouldn't have had it. Clara felt the room shift. Someone in your organization, again. Yes. The word came out tight and contained the controlled burn of a very dangerous man keeping himself at a temperature that won't ignite the room, which means the problem isn't solved. It means the problem is bigger than you thought, Clara said. He looked at her. Dante Ricci wasn't alone, she said. Was he? Alejandro Salvatore looked at her for a long, still moment, and the answer was written clearly across his face before he said a single word. Dante Ricci had not been alone. There were 2 others. Alejandro told her that night standing in the side room off Warfield Street, with Marco watching from the corner like a man who had accepted that this conversation was going to happen, whether he approved of it or not. 2 other men inside the organization. One had been with Alejandro for 7 years, the other for 4. Both placed carefully, both trusted incrementally, both turned by Lorenzo Carboni through the oldest method available to a man with patience and money. He had simply waited until each of them needed something badly enough, and then he had provided it. How long have you known, Clara asked, about the others since tonight? Alejandro's voice was completely controlled, which meant underneath it something was moving fast and hot. The message sent to your phone came from an internal server. Marco traced it in 40 minutes, which means whoever sent it is still inside. Was still inside. He glanced at Marco. Past tense as of an hour ago. Clara didn't ask for clarification. She had stopped asking for clarification on certain things because the clarifications didn't change what had happened and only added weight she had to figure out how to carry. She was getting better at choosing what to pick up. So it's done, she said. All 3. The Carboni family still exists, Alejandro said. Lorenzo Carboni still exists. Removing his assets inside my organization removes his intelligence, but it doesn't remove his motivation. Then what does he looked at her directly? Removing his leverage. What leverage does he have left? Alejandro was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. Clara felt it before she understood it. The pause, the specific quality of it, the way Marco suddenly became very interested in the wall to his left. She felt the shape of the answer before she heard it. Me, she said. Alejandro didn't deny it. The message to your phone was a test. They wanted to see if you'd run or if you'd call me. Either answer told them something. His jaw tightened. They know now that you're not just a witness. They know you're... He stopped, chose the word significant. To you. Yes. The words sat between them without ornamentation. Not managed, not wrapped in careful language. Just yes, blunt and real, and the most unguarded thing he'd said to her since they met. Clara took a breath. So I've gone from a witness they might get around to leverage they can actively use. In the last 4 hours, yes. Because I came here instead of running. Because you called me before you ran, he said. There's a difference, and they saw it. She sat down. Not because her legs were failing, because she needed a moment to think, and thinking while standing felt wasteful. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the floor and moved through it logically the way she'd learned to move through every crisis that didn't come with a manual. Options, she said. Marco made a small sound. She looked up at him. You have something to say? He looked at Alejandro. Alejandro tilted his head slightly, the go-ahead of a man who has decided to let the room be what it is. Marco looked back at Clara with the expression of someone recalibrating for the 3rd time in a month. Option 1, Marco said carefully. We relocate you. New city, new identity, covered completely. You disappear from Moreno City entirely. No, Clara said immediately. Option 2, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. We provide security at your current location indefinitely, which is visible, which, as you've already pointed out, creates questions. Also no. Option 3, he paused. You come inside. The room went quiet enough that Clara could hear the traffic outside. Inside, she repeated. Into the structure, Marco said. Formally, you become, he seemed to be selecting language very precisely, part of the household, which gives you full security without the visibility problem and removes you as external leverage because you're no longer external. Clara looked at Alejandro. He was watching her with the stillness she knew by now, the kind that meant he was waiting, genuinely waiting, not managing the outcome. That was your option, she said to him. Not Marco. I outlined it, Alejandro said. Marco presented it. Those aren't the same thing. What does inside actually mean? It means you live within my security perimeter, he said. You keep your job as we agreed. You keep everything you've asked to keep. But where you sleep, where you are when you're not parting, that's within reach. Your reach. My protection. He didn't back away from the distinction she was pushing on. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the gilded cage people in stories like mine always end up in, she said flatly, where everything is provided and nothing is owned. Then tell me how to make it different, he said, because I am asking you, Clara, not arranging, asking. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her apartment, the smell of someone else's cooking the window over the parking street, the nightstand with the pin and the phone, and the $3.99 concealer. She thought about what she'd be walking away from, and the honest answer was very little that she'd chosen. Most of it had been chosen for her by debt and circumstance, and the specific arithmetic of being a person without resources in a city that charged you for everything. She thought about what she'd be walking toward. That answer was less clear, and the lack of clarity was the most honest thing about it. I want a door, she said. Alejandro's expression didn't change. Explain. I want a door that I can open from the inside. She held his gaze. Not a lock that keeps things out. A door I can choose to walk out of. If I'm inside, it has to be because I keep choosing to be, not because the outside isn't available anymore. He was quiet. If that's not possible, she said, then option 2, visible security and the questions that come with it. I'll handle the questions. It's possible, Alejandro said. You're certain. I've never kept anyone against their will. He said it with the particular firmness of a man correcting a record he finds important. That is one line I don't cross. There are others you do. Yes. No hesitation. There are others I do, but not that one. She believed him. She had asked herself multiple times over the past weeks whether her belief in him was earned or manufactured by proximity, and she had not found a clean answer. What she had found was that he had told her the truth every time she'd demanded, it had backed down every time she'd pushed back with something real, and had said, I don't know when he didn't know, instead of filling the space with something easier. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, the rarest thing she'd encountered in a long time. All right, she said. Marco let out a breath that he'd clearly been holding for several minutes. There are conditions, as she said, looking at Marco now, because some of this needed to be said to someone who would operationalize it rather than just hear it. I tell my cousin Demi, not the details, But she knows I've moved and she has a way to reach me. Demi is not managed, not watched, not followed. She's my person and she stays mine. Marco looked at Alejandro. Alejandro nodded. I keep my shifts at the cafe. If the security situation ever requires I miss work, I'm told why not managed out of it with some excuse. I make that call myself. Agreed, Alejandro said. And she paused. This last one was the one that mattered most and she wanted to say it correctly. I want a role, not a title, not something decorative. If I'm inside your world and I'm thinking about it anyway, which I am whether I want to or not, then I want to actually think about it. With you, as someone whose input counts. Alejandro was very still. I'm not asking to run anything, she said. I'm asking not to be furniture. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said the Carboni situation, the Matteo angle you identified at dinner. What about it? I've been considering it since you said it. He leaned forward slightly. Matteo Carboni wants his father's operation. He's been waiting for Lorenzo to hand it over for 6 years. Lorenzo won't. Lorenzo is a control architect. He doesn't hand things over, he accumulates. He paused, which means Matteo is frustrated. And a frustrated heir in a family like this is a pressure point, Clara said. A significant one, yes. His expression was the most open, she'd seen it genuinely engaged, not performing engagement. The question is how to reach him in a way that doesn't accelerate the threat. You can't reach him, Clara said. Not directly, he'll see it coming. You need someone he doesn't expect, which requires someone outside my known structure. He held her gaze. Someone new enough that they don't appear in any file the Carbonas have built on my organization. The air shifted. You're not suggesting me, Clara said. I'm presenting logic, he said carefully. What you do with it is your decision. That's a very elegant way of suggesting me. I told you I was better at protection than permission, he said. I'm trying to do better. She should have said no. Every version of the girl she'd been a month ago would have said no, with both hands, and backed away from the table. But that girl had been keeping her head down for 24 years and was drowning in someone else's medical bills, and had spent a decade not choosing anything because choice felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. This felt like choice, real choice with real consequence, arrived at by her own logic. Tell me about Matteo, she said. And just like that, something in the room rearranged. Marco sat down. Alejandro talked. Clara listened and asked questions and pushed back on 2 assumptions and offered a different read on one of his premises that made him stop mid-sentence and reconsider. And somewhere in the middle of it, she became aware that this was not a briefing. This was a conversation between 2 people thinking through a problem together, and the quality of Alejandro's engagement was not the quality of a man humoring an outsider. It was the quality of a man who had found someone who could keep up. That went on for 2 hours. At the end of it, they had the outline of something. Not a plan. Plans required more information, more time, more pieces. But the skeleton of an approach, and Clara had contributed 3 of its most important bones, and she knew it, and Alejandro knew it, and Marco Resti, who had spent 20 years as the smartest person in most rooms he entered, was looking at her with an expression that had completed its journey from wariness to something considerably closer to respect. I need to call Demi, Clara said. Use the room next door, Marco said, and left without being asked, which told her everything about how thoroughly the evening had shifted. She called Demi at 11 p.m., which Demi forgave, because Demi always forgave her, and she said what she could say, which wasn't an everything, but was enough that she was moving, that she was okay, that things had gotten complicated in ways she'd explain when she could, that she needed Demi to trust her and not ask too many questions yet. Demi was quiet for a moment. Is this about the man from the alley? She asked. Clara closed her eyes. Yes. Are you safe? Yes. Are you? Demi paused, and Clara could feel her choosing the question carefully. Are you okay? Not safe? Okay. Clara thought about it honestly. She thought about the silver pin and the door she'd demanded, and the 2 hours of thinking out loud with a man who'd listened like what she said mattered. She thought about the crack in the wall she'd built when she was 11 years old and how she'd been afraid of it, and how it turned out the light coming through it was not dangerous. I think I'm more okay than I've been in a long time, she said. I know that doesn't make sense. It makes a little sense, Demi said quietly. Sunday dinner still stands? Sunday dinner always stands. She hung up. She stood in that room for a moment, in the specific quiet of a decision that's been made and landed and settled, and she let herself feel the weight of it without trying to reframe it into something smaller. Then she went back. Alejandro was standing when she returned. Marco had gone. It was just the two of them, and the room was quiet, and he looked at her across it with an expression that was entirely unmanaged, not performing calm, not constructing composure, just looking at her. "You stayed," he said. It echoed the alley. She knew he meant it too. "I stayed," she said. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see all the things his face usually kept in reserve, the fatigue she'd noticed at the restaurant, the long weight of a life lived in a language that didn't have a word for rest. Close enough that she could see the moment he decided not to manage whatever was on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said, not as a tactical update, not as a condition or an arrangement. She waited. "I don't know what this is yet," he said. "You were right that I said that, but I know that when that message came through to your phone tonight, what I felt was not about logistics." He held her gaze without flinching. "I'm not built to say this easily, so I'm going to say it plainly and only once, and you can do whatever you want with it." Clara's heart was doing something she was not going to examine right now. "You are the first person in 22 years who made me feel like the weight was something I could set down," he said. "Not carry differently. Set down." He paused. "I don't know what to do with that, but I know it's true." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a girl who kept every rule and looked away from everything and built her walls so high that nothing fell in or out. She thought about a garbage bag and a crack of bone and 6 feet of pavement that turned out to be a border crossing. She thought about what her mother had told her all those years ago, "Because he wants to wake up tomorrow, baby." And she thought about how that lesson had been about fear and how she had carried it as fear, and how it had only recently occurred to her that wanting to wake up tomorrow could also just be about wanting, about finding something worth waking up for. "I don't know what this is either," she said, "but I stopped running from it 3 weeks ago, and I don't intend to start now." Something in his face broke open, quietly, completely. He reached out, and she reached back, and the space between them closed, and outside, Moreno City kept its pace, the cars and the crime, and the Carboni family recalculating the weight of 22 years of empire, pressing down on a man who had forgotten how to put it down. And none of it paused, none of it softened, because the world doesn't pause for the moment. Two people decide to stop pretending the distance between them is safer than the alternative. But inside the room, for the first time and longer than either of them could clearly remember, something that had been held very tightly was simply released. 3 days later, Clara moved. She kept her job. She kept her shifts. She kept Sunday dinner with Demi, who looked at her across the table and said nothing but understood everything, because that was what Demi did. She kept the silver pin not on the nightstand now, but on her jacket where it was supposed to be, where a grandmother had always intended it to go. 2 weeks after that, she sat across from Matteo Carboni in a coffee shop on the east side of the city. She was Clara Bennett, new acquaintance, nobody remarkable. A woman who was good at listening, who asked the right questions, who somehow understood the frustration of being underestimated by the very people who should have known better. Matteo Carboni talked for 90 minutes. He didn't know who she was. He had no idea. That evening, she sat down with Alejandro and Marco and told them everything Matteo had said. And as she talked, she watched Marco take notes and watched Alejandro watch her with that expression. The recalibrating one, the one she'd come to understand, meant she had exceeded some expectation. He hadn't thought to raise, and she understood something about herself that she hadn't known before any of this started. She was good at this. Not the violence, not the empire, not the parts that would always belong to a world she would never fully inhabit. But the thinking, the reading of people, the ability to sit across from a man and hear not just what he said, but the shape of what he needed, she was good at that. She had always been good at that. She just hadn't had a stage large enough to know it. At the end of the debrief, Marco said, "The Carboni structure has 3 pressure points we didn't have access to 48 hours ago." He looked at Clara with no hedging, no residual wariness. "All 3 came from tonight." Clara nodded. She didn't perform modesty. She'd earned the acknowledgement, and she took it cleanly, the way she'd learned to take the pen and the phone and the things that were offered without conditions. Later, when Marco had gone and the work of the evening was folded away, Alejandro said, "How do you feel?" She considered the question seriously. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, "which is the strangest thing I've ever felt given the route to get here." He looked at her. The route was a garbage bag, she said, and a back door and 6 feet of alley. And a choice, he said. And a choice, she agreed. He reached across and his hand covered hers on the table. And it was not a dramatic gesture. It was quiet, settled the gesture of a man who has stopped performing the absence of what he feels. And Clara turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his. Outside, Moreno City moved in its complicated, unforgiving rhythm. The Carboni family was still out there. There was still work to do, danger that didn't disappear because 2 people had found each other inside it. The world Alejandro Salvatore lived in was not a world that softened at the edges because something good had happened inside it. But Clara Bennett, 24 years old, barista daughter of a man who had left her with debt and love in equal measure, had stopped drowning. Not because someone had pulled her out of the water, because she had stopped fighting the current long enough to realize she knew how to swim. She had crossed a 6-foot alley to save a man everyone in the city had decided was not worth saving. And in doing so, she had saved herself. Not from danger. Danger was still, there would always be, there was in some ways the price of this new life she was building with both hands. But from smallness, from invisibility, from the long, slow, disappearing act of a person who keeps every rule and asks for nothing and wakes up one day in a life that fits like clothes bought for someone else. She had broken the rule, and the rule, it turned out, had been the only thing keeping her from herself.